What's up? So in this tutorial, we are going to talk about how to use your own textures in the Aziel Arts landscape material. You're more than welcome to use the textures that I have preset in the material. They're royalty free. You can use them on your own projects. But if you want to go ahead and do your own custom versions of the material, this is how you would go about it. So I'm going to come over here to the material instances here, and I've made a few versions here. And we start with the desert, grassland, or snowland. So if you want to make your own version, you can either duplicate one of those material instances or right click on the master material and make your own material instance. I'm going to go ahead and modify this existing grassland material. So I'll right click on it and duplicate it and then drag it onto my landscape. Next, let's open up this material instance and talk about it. So as you know, in the layer setup section, this is where we define kind of the features that we want to be part of this material. And right now we're just using the auto material function. So we're not using our paint layers. But if we turned on our paint layers and some of these other things, basically these other settings here expand and contract and add settings based on what you choose up here. And so the same is true with your textures here. So if I expand number 10 for textures, this list of textures will expand and contract whether I'm using landscape layers or multiple landscape layers. It will just expand and contract. For example, this snow layer is here too. I'm using some textures for the snow layer. If I was to come over here and turn off the snow layer up here in layer setup, you can see it just retracts and no longer shows those texture inputs here in the texture section. And the same is if we don't want to use our separate far texture here that's adding this satellite image in the distance, we could come over and turn off use separate far texture, and then we would no longer have that texture input, or we could turn it back on and that would expand and show us that texture input. So these texture inputs really will just adapt to however many landscape layers you're using, whether you're using slope layers or just one material, whatever you set up here, you'll basically have a separate new set of texture inputs here that you can use. Now, if you want to go ahead and replace these textures, there's lots of different ways of doing it. I like to use Quixel Megascans textures from Fab. So if you want to go ahead and grab some of those, we can come over here to Fab. And the way I like to do it is just search, let's say, a rock, and then I'll put Quixel. If I search that, and I'll look for specifically a material and texture here in the type. And these will give me a bunch of rock options. So we could go ahead and choose one of these options. This really cool cracked rock here could be interesting. And so when we download textures from Fab, something to keep in mind is that this material uses and relies on height textures for displacement, for blending. Even if you're not using displacement, it uses those height textures to blend between landscape layers in a naturalistic way, using the height information of those textures. And so we do really need displacement textures for each layer. And so when you're downloading textures from Fab, they will not give you those displacement layers, those displacement textures, those height textures in some cases, unless you use the high quality download option. So I usually just use high quality download option, and then if I need to downscale the textures later, I can always do that. So I'll go ahead and choose add to project, and these are my textures downloaded. Now, a few things to keep in mind when we're using this occlusion, roughness, metallic texture, which is packed. Occlusion, roughness, and metallic are in the red, green, and blue channels, and this is the format that this particular material uses. I've set it up this way to use this type of texture mask here because that is what Fab uses. It's pretty standard. But if you're using your own textures, I have a tutorial that's right below this one that shows you how to pack your own occlusion, roughness, and metallic into a single texture. So you can use textures from other websites and that might not necessarily pack them in the same way. So definitely check out that tutorial if you'd like to do that. But these are packed for us automatically because we're using Fab. So I can go ahead and drag in this occlusion, roughness, metallic texture into my slope texture input. So I'm going to replace this rock here that is part of the slope. So we have our flat texture areas, and then we have our slope texture areas. And like I said, those are turned on and off here by using float masking. So if we have this turned on, we'll have a different material, whether the surface is flat or angled. And this gives a really natural look. So I'm actually just going to be replacing this vertical surfaces texture, which is rock. And so I've replaced here the slope, occlusion, roughness, metallic here, and I will replace the slope color, and I will replace the slope normal and the height. There we go. Now, something to keep in mind with your height maps. If I open up this height map, I double click on it, all of our height maps here, we want to make sure that the compression settings are not set to alpha, but they are set to vector displacement. And we want to make sure that sRGB here is turned off. If we saw some of those weird color things happening with the grass, that's probably because it's reading the displacement map in as an alpha compression type for some reason. Not sure why it does that by default, but this is what you want to check and make sure you change the compression settings here with no sRGB. On that note, for the mask texture, we want to make sure it is set to mask as the compression type and no sRGB. The normal map usually comes in correct as a normal map compression type with no sRGB, and the color map usually will come in as well correct as the default with the sRGB turned on. And so if you have all of your textures set up in that way, they should be read correctly into the material. Okay, so this is looking wonderful. Usually when I do replace textures, I tend to like to come back to my landscape and rebuild Nanite just in case. So it's looking like it has picked it up just fine, but just in case, I'll come over here and choose rebuild data here. I will also come over here and make sure I choose pre-compute static visibility to fix any of those weird shadow artifacts. Okay, so this rock actually is coming in very well calibrated, but occasionally your height maps, they all are kind of different. They're all kind of different. The information is gathered and compressed into different ranges. It's between 0 and 1, but just the way that the height maps are built can be different depending on who's making them. And so you'll often get like very different results here in the height map, like that'll be really strong or not strong enough. So I often do have to come over to my material after I add my new textures in, and I will come to the height section here, and I will probably need to adjust the slope, height, strength here, or midpoint to get it to look correct. So if I felt like it was too strong, I could lower the height strength a little bit here to make it a little bit flatter, or if I needed to adjust the midpoint of the height, I could do that as well. But I think this looks actually pretty great, so I'm going to leave it as is. And we could go ahead and replace our grass layer or any of our other texture inputs just the same way. So, all right, so that's how you use your own textures in the Aziel Arts material. It's very simple. You just come into the texture section and drag in the appropriate textures for the appropriate layer that you're using. You can replace pretty much everything here. So you can replace the snow textures, you can replace the color variation noise that I'm using for the landscape color variation, you can replace the satellite image I'm using. Everything is replaceable and modular, so you can really leverage this material to make any kind of looking landscape that you want. All right, hopefully you found this helpful. I will see you in the next one.